Hello and welcome to the Read to Know podcast, where the goal is to actually remember what you read. We do this not just to remember what we read, but to also apply it. Because if we don't apply what we read and we don't remember what we read, then it really wasn't even worth reading in the first place. On this podcast, we go through a book one chapter at a time, and each week we actually practice remembering what we've read. So if you want to follow along, we're currently working our way through Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This week, we're discussing Habit 2, Begin with the End in Mind. And next week, we'll be looking at Habit number 3, which is Put First Things First. I'm Zach Brown, and my friend Chris Yarber is joining me to help discuss and break down this book. And hey, if you've listened to the first couple episodes of us, thanks for listening. We really appreciate that you're following along. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please, it would help us a ton if you left a rating and a review. It only takes a second, and it helps push this show to new listeners. And if you're not on Apple Podcasts, no worries. Just share this with a friend who might be interested. Anyway, with that being said, thanks again for listening and enjoy the conversation. So Chris, you told me you went golfing this morning.
I
How
did.
was that?
For the first time in forever. I don't golf a lot. I own golf clubs only because my wife's grandfather gave them to me.
Yeah.
So I got them for absolutely free. And they look amazing because he actually did some minor like PGA touring stuff. He's really good. At 70 plus years old, he can hit a golf ball further and harder than I will ever be able to hit one. But yeah, this morning I went golfing and had my best game ever. I've been 4 times. Like actually, I've been to the driving range quite a bit.
Right.
But when it comes to actually playing 9 or 18 holes,
Four times.
4 times.
It's more
this
than
was
I
the
have.
4th time. And I was able to go 8 over par, which was amazing for me on the back 9. So congratulations.
I'll trust
to
that
me.
that's a good score.
Yes.
I'm more of a top golf guy because that's a little bit more. It's easier to step into if you can't play golf.
Yeah.
You can, even if you're terrible at golf. The funny thing about top golf is that even if you're terrible at it,
It
you
makes
can
you-
still get some points on the board. It's still possible.
It
'cause
makes
I've
you
seen it
feel like
happen.
you're good.
Yeah.
You
it
may
makes
not be
feel
good,
better.
but it makes you feel like you're good.
At least better than you are.
Yeah, and that's why I don't play golf a lot because it's one of those sports that just makes you feel like you're not enough.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Speaking though of first times in forever,
yes.
I went back to the gym today.
Yes, you did.
Back to an actual gym, and you're coming again with us tomorrow.
I am.
You're joining
I'm
back
being
up.
proactive and choosing to be in the gym once more.
I'm excited to get back into it.
Me too.
It's been fun.
It has been.
So, habit 1 was last week. We're in habit 2 now. We're making our way through this book. We're getting there. Habit 2, begin with the end in mind. And I remember we thought that the first chapter was dense. This one is too, man.
No, when it comes to the length, I hope this chapter is the longest chapter in the book.
It is. I looked actually because I was unsure. I was like, let me see how long these other ones are. This is the longest
Right.
chapter right here.
Okay, good. Well, and I say that only because this is just a personal reading preference. I don't mind seeing a lot of chapters in a book if they're shorter, but less chapters, and you see that it's a pretty thick book because this book that we started off this podcast with is a pretty dense book. I feel like in this second habit chapter that the information is not as difficult to understand.
Yeah.
But he does unpack a lot.
Yeah.
And
I would
the
agree with that.
Yeah. And the first thing that he starts off with is begin with the end in mind. That's the name of the habit. And so he starts off with quite a unique illustration. I think something that we all have heard before or something similar to it. He starts off with a picture and he asks you in the book to get to a place where you're reading this on your own, like away from all distractions, away from family, away from your pets, away from even your phone, maybe away from everything, and really sit down and think this. So naturally, while I was reading this, I was watching TV with my wife's mom and brother sitting beside me talking to Megan, who was in the kitchen, so they're all talking loud. So, of course, I followed that advice. But it's hard to get away sometimes, But if you are reading this, I would go back and read that again and just to get away and to really think about this. But he starts off with this illustration that imagine that you're going to a funeral. Mm-hmm. And the funeral is not for yourself, but you're going to this funeral and you go in and you sit down and people begin to speak. And there's 4 different speakers. And these 4 different speakers represent 4 different areas of a person's life. Whether it's someone close to them, a family member, then the second person may be someone that you worked with. The third person may be from either your church or a nonprofit or some community-centered activity that you take place in. And then a fourth one as well. All of them talking about different areas and values that you had. And he asked in the book, when starting off with this habit, think about what would those people say, or 4 people in those kind of areas of your life, what would they say at your funeral? What would people say about your character, about things that you accomplished? What would they say about your integrity? Different things like that. And that's really how he starts off this chapter, beginning with the end in mind. Go to your funeral. How would people talk about you? What would they say?
Yeah.
Is really the driving motivation for this chapter.
And he, again, takes the rest of the chapter to kind of delve into that and unpack, kind of the why behind the what, the what being just kind of imagining that. What do you really, it comes down to, what do you want your life to look like after it's all said and done? And again, begin with the end in mind is, he takes like 2 hours of an audiobook to go into this simple kind of idea, simple kind of topic.
Is that how long the chapter was?
Yeah, I did. Was
that listening on 1.5 speed?
No, that was just normal. So like regular speed, it's 2 hours. The first chapter though, it was only like 1 hour and 7 minutes.
Okay.
So it's almost twice as long, just listening at regular speed. So if you listen faster than that, then it's shorter. But yeah, it's definitely a long chapter for sure. So he goes into that and he's talking about, kind of these overarching themes of what we want our lives to be, how we want to be remembered, what are the most important things in life really is what he's getting at. And it's kind of this whole theme of, we tend to forget about, again, as he calls it, getting stuck in the thick of thin things. Mm-hmm. We tend to forget about actually what we really hold as most important, what we hold most important to us. We tend to forget about that in the daily things of life, between the minutia, the as he calls it, management side of life.
Yes.
As he talks about the difference between management and leadership, is that management is the working on tasks or to-do lists or jobs, activities, when leadership is actually taking a step back and thinking about the why behind the what that is done. And there's another quote that he uses that would probably say it better than I can, but that's pretty much the idea between leadership and management, is that the leadership is the why we do what we do, the purpose behind it, and the management is the doing of those things.
Yes. One of the reasons why this chapter is so long is because the endless almost illustrations that he gives for these principles that he breaks out. And there's one illustration that stood out to me about this difference between managing your life and leading your life, which can also apply, as we've seen with this book, to your organization or your work or what have you. And so he says that, we can kind of picture life as a jungle. There's a lot of different paths that you can take. Managing your life is you're going through your life and you have a machete and you're chopping down and you're working your way through every single day. The manager is kind of the person behind who's sitting there and sharpening that machete and handing it back, and they're chopping through. Leadership is in fact climbing to maybe the tallest tree around you, looking out at that jungle and saying, wait a minute, this is the wrong direction. This is the wrong jungle. We're not going the right way. And so a lot of people prize management but neglect leadership.
Yeah.
And there's such a difference between those two things, and we get stuck in that ordinary managing, progressing through life. We said before we started that managing is oftentimes attractive because we're getting a lot done in those moments. And when we really sit back, and he uses the word meditate and think, and we'll get into that. But as we take a step back into leadership, to look at our life as a whole and the values and reflect on these different things, such as this mission statement that we'll talk about, to step back and to do those things, it doesn't seem like it's doing a whole lot, but it is putting us in the right direction to accomplish what we really value in life.
Yeah. And that's a great example. It really is it's almost comical when you think about it that way.
Right.
Because, this is something that can happen on a personal level and as an organizational level, as in some kind of, body or organization or group.
Right. And that breaks down even as small as your family, for example.
Yeah. And he talks about all those kind of different sectors later on in the chapter. But the funny thing about that, I think the last line of that story is that he's like, hey, we're going the wrong way, or we're in the wrong jungle. And they respond, the people on the ground chopping with the machetes, they respond with, but we made so much progress, we got to keep going.
Yes, now I remember that. Yes, they do respond
Which is
with that.
That's what makes it comical, but we tend to be like that on a personal level and as an organizational level, like when we're a part of a group or something like that. We're afraid to change course because of so much progress that we've made in this area, even if it's not an area that is actually worth, spending a lot of time or making progress in.
Right.
We're afraid to pivot once we've committed to something that, we find may not be on our priority list or may be pushed upon us. And that's kind of what really the next thing that he gets into in this chapter is the idea of where he calls it where our center comes from, kind of what directs our life. And it builds on to the proactivity, idea well. It builds on to habit 1 very well. And he talks about things can be pushed on us as far as how we live, or the scripts. He talks about the scripts that we live by. Either if we behave reactively, then they can be pushed on us by other people, whether that's family, friends, coworkers, your boss, etc. If we live proactively, we choose to write our own scripts, and we are in full control of our lives. And he goes on to say that, talks about basically, he makes this point maybe a couple times, I think, in the chapter. He talks about chapter 1 is realizing you're in control.
Yes.
And habit 2, chapter 2, is realizing now it's time to do something about it. That's what
he says habit 1 in a couple different places. You're right. He does say that. He says habit 1 at the beginning. He says you're the creator.
Yeah.
You're in control. There are things outside of your control. And again, he brings in that circle of influence, because a lot of these values and a lot of these centers are in the center of our influence. And so there are things within our control. These are things that we can change. So habit 1 defines that we are the creator. And I love last week how we pointed out that only you can realize this for yourself. You cannot push this on to other people. It's not going to work. People don't like it when we're pushy anyway. No one likes to hear you're the problem. But we can tell ourselves that we're the problem. And when we come to that realization, that's where it starts and opens up to reach these centers. And then habit 2, he doesn't say it exactly like this, but habit 2 is, okay, now start creating.
Right.
Start creating these centers. Start looking at these and seeing what were the 4 things. He says, based on where your center's at, it will control... it was it strength?
Strength, power, wisdom,
and guidance.
Security. Or wait.
Security. Yes, it was security.
Was guidance one of them? Guidance might have been
guidance,
one of them.
Security, wisdom, guidance, and power.
Power. Yep, that's 4. It. Yep.
Remember.
And that's where they said those things flow out of your center.
Yes.
Basically. And so whatever you have at the center of your life, as far as principles to live by, is how that flows. So if you have something that is in the center of your life that's, as he says, that's not principles, because he talks about principles is what you should center your life around, because those principles are never changing. They don't change. So if you say, if you're family centered, family might be good, but family dynamics change. Family shifts and moves and changes. So your security, power, guidance, and wisdom shift depending on how that family dynamic is going.
Yes.
Really is what he's saying. And I actually want to kind of maybe take a little step back and go back to the different centered and the scripts that people may like put on you, or if you're not proactive. So the interesting thing, I think, for me, at least when it comes to like scripts and things like that, is that these scripts, writing your own script, as he says, writing your own program. He uses the computer language at one point too, and he says habit 1 is you're the programmer, and habit 2 is write the program. You writing your own program, it's actually not a selfish thing. And that's, I think, for me, I think a lot of people, including myself at times, I will take on other people's scripts. So just for an example, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like but I think it comes from a place of wanting to be helpful to others, wanting to serve, wanting to, be a benefit to other people. I think where a lot of people might find themselves, it's not a bad thing. It's not bad intentions that they have in maybe making one of those things the center. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so it's actually not selfish to be principle centered instead of family centered or spouse centered or work centered.
Right.
But being actually principle centered allows you to have a better balance to all those things and to be able to treat them in the way that they should be treated and fit in the domain that's allocated for that.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
It does make sense. And for someone who has a problem saying no to other people, it's not selfish. In fact, what it's doing is it's opening you up to those values and saying yes to the right things.
Exactly, yeah.
And as we talk about this mysterious principle that we speak about, he does not give you a principle. As we were reading this chapter, we were both looking for this principle because he kept talking about it. He kept saying, if you're principle-centered. Well, what principle is he talking about? And pretty much through this chapter, he's talking about, no, you define that.
Yeah.
He breaks down these different centers, as we'll talk about, and he talks about how the best script that you can follow or write for yourself is this principle, is this mission that you write for yourself. But it's up to you to decide what principle you follow.
Yeah.
And so that piece of advice for me, again, just like the first habit of being proactive and realizing that we're the ones in control, we're the ones who are writing and are creating, this one really enables me to say no to even things that sound good and are well-intentioned, to say no to those things, to stick close to the principle and the values that you've set. Sounds really selfish, but it's really not.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about it is that those principles that he talks about, a principle-centered living, those principles are whatever you make them, but he doesn't define those principles, but he gives you an exercise to actually be able to come up with those principles. And that's what the funeral idea, the funeral story at the beginning of the chapter is in purpose of. That's the reason behind it, is to help you identify what those principles are actually in your life. And he uses another example that he did with college students, where if you only had one semester of college left to live, what would you do differently? And not only he challenges them, not even what would you do differently, but try and live that way for a week, see what happens, And they came back with stories of them, doing things that they'd never done before, being real meaningful in their relationships. And he even says, I think the quote is, they had a sense of reverence even just about their life and, the actions that they take and what they do,
Yes.
And it's really a powerful and heavy thing when you really sit and think about it. And he gets into it, I think, a little bit later, talking about, I think we're about to enter the mission statement section of this chapter. But even at the beginning, I was thinking about it, and it kind of ties back to something he says later about mission statements, is that when I was going through that exercise about the funeral, I sat there and I thought about it for a few minutes. And I did the exercise how he wanted us to, but I still felt like it wasn't quite resolved, like my answer that I wrote down. And I think it was that as we get into it, mission statements aren't something that's just like a one and done or something that is just like quickly written up and then boom, you're done. He says it's something that takes months, sometimes up to months, but can take days, weeks, multiple weeks to come to the final conclusion. And even then you're still reviewing and making changes when necessary. But that's what, it's that funeral exercise is the beginning of figuring out your principles, your guiding principles, which then lead into what your mission statement would be, in a sense.
Right.
And that's kind of where I like that funeral thing is just kind of the beginning of working through that.
Yes.
So he gives you exercises to get to that point.
Yes. Yeah, the mission, I love how he talks about the mission statement as if it's a constitution, something, of course, growing up in America and learning about American history, we understand very well when we use that word constitution, what that enables, kind of the laws in a sense, or abiding principles and values that you are signing your name to
Right.
follow.
Right.
Is kind of what that entails.
And when a question arises, what comes up, in the government or in the judicial system, they go, what does the Constitution say about that?
Right.
And then that's how they proceed.
Right.
And that's what he equates to our mission statement being in our lives.
Yes. Yeah. And so I love how he draws that out. And I also love how you mentioned when you first wrote down those answers from that funeral question that you didn't feel as if everything was resolved. And I think what that shows is when we react to something like that so quickly, because he does mention that this mission statement is going to take months to a couple months to write. So you have a lot of time to cognitively think about it. That first reaction, I would imagine, when you face that funeral question, if you were just to take a mic and point it at someone on the street and ask them that question, their gut reaction would be what's coming from inside of their heart, their emotion, what oftentimes people would call the right side of the brain. But as we get into this mission statement, you have more time to think about it and to live life for a couple months. Take this proactive, because at the end of the be proactive habit, he mentioned a 30-day challenge.
Yes.
Right? As you take that 30-day challenge, which is why I think he said it can take a couple months, because he wants you to get in the habit of being proactive first. Once you get in the habit of doing that, then you not only have your heart and your emotion responding from your right brain, but you can also take your cognitive side of your left side as well, and bleed both of those, as he calls it, using the whole brain.
Right.
Is what he says, is use the whole brain, both the cognitive and then also the imagination as well of your right brain, and the emotion and stuff like that, to resolve both of those.
Yep. And so he, this section, he talks about mission statements, and he gives a couple examples of mission statements and what they kind of mean and how people use them. And then I think the beneficial thing is after he talks about what a mission statement is and how it's like a constitution and how it's like a set of guiding principles for our life, he then talks about how to kind of implement that into like actionable steps. How do you actually then fit this into your life? You know what I mean? Say you wrote it. Okay, now you wrote it. Then what? You just walk away and you just continue living your life. What is it? How do you use it? And that's what he gets into next. And he talks about affirmations and visualization, which again is kind of something that you hear you'll hear it in probably a lot of self-help books and like things like, you just gotta, and he even mentioned that towards the beginning of it. He's like, affirmations are good or whatever, but they're not the thing, right? And he mentioned that in the very first chapter that we talked about.
Yes.
Right. And but now we're getting into that affirmation part and how they are useful to this idea of working on yourself and being effective as a individual. So the affirmations, he then says, okay, so maybe you think about it. And I talked to you about this. I mentioned this last week on the podcast, that I was like, okay, how do I be proactive? Do I sit and think about situations that might occur that I might not, and pre-decide how I would react if I hit that situation? Right? I mentioned that on the podcast last week, and that's basically what he's saying. That's basically what he's saying here. So I was getting ahead accidentally. before I even got to that point. So anyway,
you just read ahead. It's okay. Right. We understand.
Yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah.
The affirmations, he then basically takes, so you have a situation that maybe this situation arises, and for example, I think it was with him and his daughter, and he might get frustrated with something that his daughter does, and instead of behaving out of frustration or anger and reacting that way, he wants to react in a way that is congruent with his principles, his values of being like a loving, caring, guiding, father for her. And so then he writes down an affirmation that basically says something to the fact of, when my daughter does such and such, I want to react to my daughter in a way that is loving, caring, and is guiding for her as a good father. Mm-hmm. Something to that effect.
Yes. Pretty much as a family mission statement in a sense, he wrote that. And while we're on this analogy train with the family, I love how he also mentions in this part that so many parents, just to continue to follow the analogy, what they're so concerned with is, and since I'm not a dad, I know a lot about being a father. I'm just
parenting advice
repeating
here.
what he says. I'm just repeating what he says. Is he
Right.
said so many parents are concerned with winning the battle that they're not thinking of the war.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's how we also live our life as well, because just as you mentioned before
Right.
we even read this chapter, thinking through these situations and
Right.
being proactive, and also thinking with the end in mind.
Right. Even arguments with other people, or like something you don't agree on with a friend or a coworker, like
Right.
anything like that.
Yes, thinking how you would react.
Yeah.
That is thinking about the war, leading yourself through this life instead of just managing and reacting. And so I just wanted to mention that while you were on
Yeah.
the family. And
Yeah, no, that's
analogy.
good. And that's exactly, once he has that mission statement, he takes and creates an affirmation for a situation that may arise or is likely to arise again at some point, something that maybe has already happened but would have come around again. And then he practices saying that, repeating it, and then also taking into account visualizing that. So he, with that little piece of paper or whatever, he thinks about that situation, thinks about how that would play out, and then thinks about how he would want it to play out in line with his principles, values, and vision.
Yes.
And that's an important key too that he makes in that, which he then equates to being an athlete, right? Most athletes, at least most pro athletes, they have some kind of visualization that they probably frequently do when it comes to performing at a high level, competing and in their sports or events that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure like Michael Phelps like sits there on the bleachers with his headphones on, probably just thinking about the race ahead and how he's gonna dive into the water, how he's
Right.
gonna flip that turn, all that stuff.
Right.
And that's an important thing that we can bring into our lives, not just with sports,
Right.
but for anything, a business meeting, a conference call, or even a relationship with friends,
Yes.
anything that is important that we want to, basically it's just like another way of prepping for a situation. And he talks about that integrating, and all that is integrating the right side of the brain.
Yes. Yes. And this is where, again, and I'll bring it up time and time again, my favorite part of the chapter was this whole part on leading.
Yeah.
All of that you just walked us through, using all of those different areas in our life that this could be effective, not only in our work, but also in personal as well. This is leading. So all of that you just unpacked,
Yeah.
all of that is leadership. And on the outside, you have done nothing. Because
Right.
it's all inward.
Right,
And so
yeah.
to everyone else, you haven't changed.
Right.
But
That's a good distinction to make, actually, because I think that's not something that he explicitly says in that way in this chapter. But actually, I like that a lot. That's a good distinction to make, is that it's leadership, but on the outside, it doesn't really feel like you're doing anything.
No.
And that's the problem. That's why it's so hard to do.
Right. And he mentions in one of the illustrations in the book, he mentions how, because Stephen Covey, not Covey. I want to say Covey all the time, but it's not Covey.
There were a couple times I think you said it the last few weeks.
Yes, there were, and I do apologize. Covey. I may just call him Stephen.
Steve.
Anyway, Stephen R. So, Stephen, there are a couple times where there is one illustration, where he talks about an experience he had where he goes and pretty much mentors and does presentations and kind of helps different businesses and organizations.
Mm-hmm.
He's mentioned that. I think he's just bragging about it, but he mentions it like once every single
Right.
chapter. He's like, I helped out this organization this one time. And he mentions in this specific example that a leader, a very high executive of a company, was doing a lot of managing, but hardly any
Leading,
leadership. And he was
yeah.
talking about the difficulty that those two dynamics bring, switching from the managing to the leadership. And so this is not easy, again, whatsoever to do, just as we mentioned with the proactive chapter last week. This is not easy to do whatsoever. This executive found that he kept wanting to go back because he's such in the habit of managing. He kept talking about how he wanted to go back. But on the outside, to a lot of different people, it looked like he just separated himself and stopped doing certain things. But really, he was making that inward, which ultimately led to outward, because he talks about how they like quadrupled their sales and stuff like that.
Right.
After that, it doesn't appear to be a lot of difference on the surface. But when those crucial moments come to either work towards the center principal value of your life, or to work away from that, we will find that when we're leading and making inward changes, again, inside out, we're just going to go back. This is going to happen every single chapter.
Reference an older chapter.
Referencing all the chapters.
They build on each other.
They do.
It's true.
He does a good job of that in this book.
Yeah.
And so that's where it really makes the difference.
Yeah.
From the inside.
And also I think it's a good thing to mention. It's not that it's a bad thing to do management type things. It's not a bad thing to be in a kind of a managerial role or do those things from time to time. In that situation, that leader obviously realized that for his work, it's more ROI positive for him to be in a more of a leadership role and do more of those type things. But we all obviously have some balance. We can't be all one, we can't just 100% of our lives be like leadership oriented, thinking about how we're gonna, what we want to do, and we have to do the managing at some point of our lives. It's a balance between the two, but our normal tendency is to lean too far into the managing side of that.
Yes.
So, and again, it's a balance, right?
It is.
Again, it's another example really of a P to PC balance.
Yes, it is.
So
production capability.
Yep.
Go back and listen to episode 2 if you didn't get that. Yeah. Yeah. But if you're ready, let's break down some of these different centers that he talks about.
Yeah, let's do it.
And he breaks down these centers because he wants you to realize, okay, maybe although you may even at this point have a principle in mind, as we talk about having one principle, writing a personal mission statement, which, by the way, if you're listening to this and haven't written a personal mission statement, 99.9% of Americans have not either. So
Probably not.
Probably not. And again, it takes months to do, so it's not going to be done right after you finish listening to this. But he talks about these different centers that we can be towards and how they affect. And when we open up the book, I can flip through those because again he gives more infographics. Yeah. Infographics of how these different centers affect our stability, wisdom, power, and guidance as well. So he talks about how all of those break out. But he talks about if you're married, having a spouse centeredness,
right,
and how it affects those 4 fundamental values in our life. And then also family as well, and being money-centered. And he goes into details, but they're pretty self-explanatory, the money. And then also, since we talked about selfishness earlier, this being so valued and principle-centered sounds selfishness, but the emphasis is not on ourself. The emphasis is on the principle, and that's why it's not selfish. Yeah. But we can be selfishly centered. Right. Can. We're really good at that. Most of us are. And then also there was also a church-centeredness that he talks about for us in the South can also be a big thing here on the East Coast. But and that doesn't only have to be church. It could be any organization centeredness as well. And did I say money already?
Maybe. But then there was also friend and enemy centeredness, which was interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and all these, honestly, this section was so telling. Yes. In maybe not in a good way. I think we mentioned last week as well. Like some of this stuff, like it hits home a little bit. Yeah. It stings a little bit.
It's like he's shining a light down on your life. Right. And he's like, all right, you have this part, and then you have this part, and then you have this part, and then you have this part.
If you're looking at it honestly, yeah. And that's the thing he says. Usually, not one person is all one centeredness, right? We can have aspects of all those areas of centeredness. We could be a little bit in the selfish, and we can have a little bit in the work, and we can have a little bit in the friend or enemy, centeredness.
And these ebb and flow too in our life. There may be times where we may be less centered on maybe family and more centered on money or vice versa. Yeah. And
the interesting thing about it is that he takes each of those sections and then he talks about what it would look like from looking at your security, looking at your guidance, looking at your wisdom, and looking at your power from those centered avenues. Yes. Which was the telling part. You know what I mean? You read through those and you're like, that sounds a little bit like me. you know? And man, it's just another thing to help like kind of open our eyes a little bit as to where we might be needing to correct course as what this whole, chapter is about. And I mean, of course, it doesn't mean that we are not 100% like we're not 100% terrible people because we're not, centered on principles, 100% of the time. Like he says, we ebb and flow between a lot of those. And I think also it was interesting is that he talked about, is that we can still have those principles that we want. Obviously those principles come out when we really think about it. They're there. As I said, they're not non-existent in our lives. They're there, but they might just be covered up by the thick of thin things. The management covers up the principles that are really there inside of us that we just need to kind of pull out and then place at the forefront of our mind and attention.
Yes. And that's the importance of writing this down and really doing that and physically putting it in front of us, because that is something that if we just do internally to forget about in a week or so, and then to realize, at one time I thought about this, but it's too late because we've ventured too far into the jungle of life, so to speak, to maybe change directions. But and that's the importance between actually writing it down and getting this out. Yeah. So, but I tell you, to be honest with you, I'm ready to open up the book if you are. Yeah. Because earlier I keep saying stability instead of strength. And so I'm ready to get into these 4 fundamental values. That's how you know, for anyone who's listening, for anyone watching, you see that we don't have the book in front of us. For anyone listening, if we mess up, it's because we're trying to remember just as well as you are, as you have conversations with your friends about this. So not perfect whatsoever. Yep.
I think that pretty much covers up until like the very last section. And I think the last section was just talking about how this applies, begin with the end in mind, applies to more than just you personally, and how it applies to an organization or a family, and that type of way. And that's a really powerful thing too. If you're in an organization, I think, and families are, a type of kind of like an organization, it's a body of people that work together. And it was so interesting, I think, because even, the example that he used with the hotel chain, and everyone on the company was involved in crafting their mission statement. And it even went so far down. It went all the way down. And he says, if your organization and they are guided by a mission statement, it needs to bring everyone involved. And that's the key to making it work, is that everyone needs to have something in there to claim a stake on. You know what I mean? And that's kind of like what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, is that money can't buy loyalty and commitment, but it's having a stake in what's being created and being a part of that. That's where the commitment and loyalty comes from. And so all those members being a part of creating a mission statement for the company actually made them more committed to the company as a whole. Right. And then they also know it, and they can it's always on their mind, and that's what they keep in front of them at all times. And it even went down the ladder that the company had a mission statement, that specific hotel in the hotel chain had their own mission statement that was related to the overall company's mission statement. And then even the employees at the hotel had their own personal mission statement that was then related to the hotel chain and related to the overall company's mission statement. So they even had up to their own personal. I'm a bellhop, or I'm a, even a maid or a cleaning lady at the hotel, and they have their own personal mission statement. Yeah. They themselves as an employee have their own personal mission statement. Right. Which is just so really foreign. It's a foreign way of thinking.
It is.
But I can, going through his examples and stuff, you can see the power and the potential that an idea like that actually has.
Right. One of the stories that stuck out to me as you were talking about that, it reminded me of how he was giving a presentation at a hotel in a conference room, and he needed some colorful pens, and so he ran outside to this guy who he asked for pens, and he didn't tell him to go check the front desk or to go, because that wasn't his job. That's not why he was there, to find someone pens. Yeah. His response was, "I will accomplish that for you." Right. Which only a response can be done at that kind of level, when everyone has something to invest in the creating process, as you spoke to. Right. So quite incredible that they were able to do that. Quite moving, not only on a personal level but an organizational
Right.
as well.
Which that guy probably had something else to do. He was probably in the middle of another task.
Right, probably.
And
could
Stephen
have been finding pens for someone else.
Right. And Stephen Covey comes up to him and says, "Hey, I got a problem. I need pens." And he goes, "I will solve your problem." That's basically what he says. And yeah, that he drops everything that was on his plate before for customer service, which was a big part of their mission statement.
Right.
And
which for any organization, that's really what you're trying to do. For any organization, it's created to solve a problem. And so you identify that problem, and then the mission statement says how you're going to go about completing and solving that problem. And I just think it's fantastic that every single person had a stake in that, and they were able to creatively use their imagination and their consciousness as well to creatively add to solve that problem.
Right. Yeah, and it's really kind of talking about that. It just is interesting that, again, this habit, which can be applied on kind of a very big, broad, wide-scaping kind of idea of your life, even, but then also just be applied to the smallest of tasks as well. Begin with the end in mind, and whatever that is, from washing your car to, again, your entire life and what that looks like. So it's, it's really interesting how these things can be applied into so many different areas of life.
Right.
And I kind of thought about this in reading this chapter, and he kind of teases it a little bit into chapter 3, because chapter 3...
Have you read chapter 3?
I have not, but based on what he said in this chapter, he talks about we're going into goals and kind of more a short-term goal setting kind of mindset for habit 3. And habit 2 is kind of like just your overall goal for life. Like it's like it's like the big goal, right? And then habit 3,
the one principle,
right?
Habit 3 is breaking that out into smaller goals, because habit 3 is still incorporated. If we remember that circle, and we remember back to independence, dependence, and interdependence. These first 3 are still in that dependence column,
moving into independence.
Yeah.
But I just thought it was cool that the whole thing, habit 2, is like the goal of life, and then we'll work into these smaller goals that then line up to the one overarching goal of our lives, basically. Yeah. So it's really interesting.
It is.
And we're in the thick of it right now.
We are.
So anyway, you ready to bring out the book?
Yeah, let's bring it out.
All right, Chris, we're back. We have our books. We're ready to go. I think we did a pretty good job of covering most of this chapter. There are definitely, looking back at it, flipping through the pages, there are a couple things that we missed, and that's why we're bringing out the book, so we can go back over and cover those things. Yeah. So we'll try not to go over in huge detail everything, because like the audiobook was 2 hours long, we don't want this to be a 2-hour podcast.
No, we do not.
We don't want to be here for 2 hours talking about this. This is good to talk about. We like talking about it.
Yes.
But we don't want it to be too long.
No,
so we're going to try and keep just the essential stuff that we missed or we need to expand on more.
Yes.
And then leave out some of the stuff that we covered pretty well in the first part.
Yes. Anytime that you have a discussion about a book with someone else, if this book may not be your cup of tea, so to speak, but maybe this podcast gets you reading another book and talking about it with another friend, there are going to be things that you can miss and will miss. And so, like you just said, I think the most helpful is to pull it back out. And when it comes to helping us to actually remember and retain what we read, going over those things we forgot puts that back in our head.
Right, exactly. And so let's begin. And I actually want to begin with his kind of definition of what it means to begin with the end in mind. We kind of covered it, our own definition we kind of came up with and talked about, but his definition is talking about habit 2, and he says that it can be applied to many different circumstances and levels of life. The most fundamental application of begin with the end in mind is to actually begin today with the image, picture, or paradigm of the end of your life as your frame of reference, or the criterion by which everything else is examined.
Yes.
And so that's his definition of begin with the end in mind in the larger context of your life.
Yes. And I like how he mentions, and it puts that as your frame of reference, kind of like your life as a picture. This is your frame. This is what's going to hold it together. This principle, this fundamental application here.
Right. And continuing that thought of, planning things out and or doing things that you're maybe the wrong things that are good things, but maybe not what is aligned with your principles directly, is that if the ladder, he has this nice analogy of a ladder leaning against a wall. So if the ladder is not leaning against the right wall, every step we take just gets us to the wrong place faster. We may be very busy and we may be very efficient, but we will not be truly effective, and will only be effective when we begin with the end in mind.
Right.
Which is very interesting.
Yes.
And so then that leads us to the first section that we kind of missed.
We did.
I think we missed it completely.
Just went right through it. We were so excited to talk about the leadership and the management that we just went right through
scripts,
it.
yep.
Right, which is the title for this section is All Things Are Created Twice.
Yep. And he says there's a mental or first creation, and then a physical or second creation to all things. And do you want to go into kind of the basics of what that means when he says that?
Well, yeah, for example, because he gives an illustration of this, just so that we understand. He says, take the construction of a home, for example. First of all, you create every detail. Before you hammer any nails whatsoever, you create every detail. You draw every blueprint. You plan every floor, every layout, every design. You draw that all out. That's the first creation. The second one is actually taking that blueprint, developing it physically. And so that's kind of the picture that he gives for this. Another example is look at his business. You want to have a successful enterprise. Again, you think through all these things, you clearly define. And we would not question this process for constructing a house or starting a business. Yeah. We don't question this process whatsoever, but we never do this in our personal life.
Yeah. That's where it doesn't. That's where it doesn't connect.
Yes.
For a lot of us, and it makes sense, doesn't it? Everything else has a plan like that, and then the second or physical creation to it. And what's funny though is he says that we don't think about this in our personal life, but it still happens. He says it doesn't just not exist. It doesn't just not exist if we're not focused on the first creation of that idea. That's where he gets into the scripts and the idea of there are other things that other people push on you. And that's actually where if you're not intentional with the first creation part of principles and idea and vision for your life, that it will get pushed on you from someone else, and that's what'll happen. So then that's why it's important to focus on the first creation, so that the physical creation, the manifestation of your life as a whole, will actually be what you want it to be.
Right. As
Andy Stanley says it, I like Andy Stanley a lot. I read a lot of his books. He's a very great communicator and speaker, and very intentional.
Has his own leadership podcast.
Yeah.
A lot of the principles and this is actually one of his favorite books.
One of his favorite books is this one right here. Yeah.
And their organization also, very, very much uses this book.
And you can tell by the way he talks and the way he communicates that he lives by a lot of these principles in this book, and he applies it to his own life. But he says it a different way, similar way. He says, I think mostly from his book Visioneering, if you've heard or listened to that. He says everyone ends up somewhere, but some people actually end up there on purpose.
Yes.
Right? We're all going to end up somewhere, but it's up to us to end up somewhere on purpose.
Yes.
So, and that's what he's talking about here.
Yes. And he actually took that book, and if I'm not mistaken, maybe made one or a couple of different sermon series.
I'm sure he did,
off of that. Me being in my line of work, of course, I do like his books and enjoy his leadership podcasts and stuff. I listen to that, but I also listen to his messages and steal a bunch of stuff from his presentation style.
Right.
Not necessarily always material, but he has a sermon series called Destination, where the whole point of that series is talking about, okay, we're all going to arrive at a destination at some point in our life.
Yeah.
And every choice we make gets us to that destination. So one day we wake up surprised where we're at.
Yeah.
When we really shouldn't be, because it's really been a culmination of our choices. So he talks about it a lot.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and that's his version of begin with the end in mind.
Yes,
and
it
that's
is.
how he, talks about that and communicates that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And okay, so then the next section is, again, we talked about it, we touched on it, the designer by default, talking about the scripts that come from other people and not our principles, right?
Yes.
And like I said, I kind of jotted this down. It's not a selfish thing to live by your principles and not from someone else's scripts. That's not what it is about. It's about being focused in what you're actually there to do. What is your overall, what's your purpose in doing the things that you do, And some of those things, as he even talks about, I think later, I'm not exactly sure where because it's not in front of me, but he mentions that talking about, like say family-centeredness versus principle-centeredness, that decision that you might make, for an example, like for some situation, it might be the same decision, the same conclusion that you would make if you were family-centered or principle-centered. The overall end decision of like whatever situation that is might be the same, but the outcome or the let's just say the actual decision-making is a whole different process. Because it's principle-centered and not, say, family-centered or work-centered or whatever that is.
Yes.
And I do want to, let me see, okay. We talked about, these other couple sections, leadership and management. We covered that pretty well. I'm going to skip that.
Pretty well.
Rescripting, we talked about that pretty well. The only thing I want to mention from that is imagination and conscience. Through imagination, we can visualize the uncreated worlds of potential that lie within us. Through conscience, we can come in contact with the universal laws or principles with our own singular talents and avenues of contribution, with the personal guidelines within which we can most effectively develop them.
Yes.
Which is, very, yeah.
And you covered self-awareness pretty well.
Yeah.
But those two combined, he said, with self-awareness, these two endowments empower us to write our own script.
Yeah.
Which you covered pretty well in the first
and
part.
And that's building on to what we talked about, the visualization side of things.
Yes.
But it comes through those avenues. And it's kind of funny. It's, again, all this stuff in this book is very intentional.
It is.
It basically boils down to just intentionality with life and how you live. And I think the interesting thing is, at least me personally, I have trouble slowing down and actually really kind of thinking about those kind of things. I don't sit down very often and think about, like life, and that sounds kind of very existential and abstract and like what, I'm just thinking about life.
Right.
But no, it's a very intentional, and I think that's what he's getting at, and that's what he's getting at through this whole book. It's all intentional, intentionality, and just being intentional with, hey, what do I want the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 30, 40, 50 years of my life to look like? And what do I want to have when it's all said and done? What I mean?
Yes. And that goes all the way back to self-awareness that we talked about earlier in this book, because he says it's combined, it's self-awareness is combined with that imagination and that consciousness, thinking about life, but when we're thinking about life, we have a purpose behind it. And the purpose is that we're not just thinking about life just to think about life as this mystical kind of sit there and think about it without any end in mind. We do have an end in mind, and that end is that principle we decide to be the guiding and framing principle of our life. And so that's why we do why we do that.
And no matter what our script looks like right now, as he says, calling back to chapter 1, we are able to rewrite those scripts that are in line with our values.
Yes, or to start a script that we have yet to start.
Yeah,
and to start our life centered on something that it may not be centered on yet. We have that, responsibility. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yep. And I think the problem that we all struggle with, me included, I definitely struggle with this, is that we get buried under layers of pressing problems, immediate concerns, and outward behaviors, and then you tend to become reactive.
Yes.
It's the thick of thin things, as he talks about and says many times throughout the first couple chapters of this book.
Yes.
And anyway, so moving on to a personal mission statement, he says the most effective way he knows how to begin with the end in mind is to develop a personal mission statement or philosophy or creed. It focuses on here's the important thing that I think we missed when we were talking about this. It focuses on what you want to be, that's character, and to do, which is your contributions and achievements, and on the values or principles upon which being and doing are based. So that's the goal of the mission statement, is to focus on your character and your contribution.
Yes, which is why it's going to be different for each person, because he also mentions that each individual is unique. This is why it's a personal mission statement, and why it's going to be different, and why if you are discussing this with a friend like me, and you may take the next month or so to really reflect on this and maybe to physically write out a mission statement of my own. I'm interested in doing that myself. And so we may sit down as friends apart from being in front of the microphone and the cameras and to talk about it, but it is going to be different. And so when you face that, remember that we all have different character, all have different contributions, what we want to do, all different drives. And so it is going to be unique.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to do, especially, I think we'll talk about, I want to touch on this when we get to the very end of the chapter, is looking at the like end of chapter, like action list or challenges.
Yes.
The after action, after chapter action tasks or things that he challenges you to do. I want to take a look at those because I think it is important to do that stuff. And like we said at the beginning of this podcast, I think the very first episode is that it's good to, our goal here is to remember what we read, but not only that, to then apply it. And if we're not applying it, then it's really not even worth remembering it in the first place.
Right.
So,
and really not really worth reading either.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's our challenge then, is to, again, as we said, continue to work on proactivity as we did this last week after we talked about it. And then also continue to work on habit 2 and begin with the end in mind, and working on crafting our own personal vision statements, our own personal mission statements.
Yes.
Focused on principles that we want to live by.
Yes.
Anyway, so moving on, we'll look at the center. We covered that pretty well. Again, the four things that flow out of our center, what we focus our life around, is wisdom, security, guidance, and power.
Yes.
Those are the four things that flow from our center. And again, he goes on to then talk about our alternative centers, like friend centers, enemy centers, church-centeredness, work-centeredness, self-centeredness, all those different things. And then goes into identifying your center, and that's when he lists all those out and kind of the things that you would think or do, the different avenues the different things that would come out if you were centered in one of those areas.
Yes.
And again, like we said, was a really telling section where it talked about for example, if you're money centered, under security, it says your personal worth is determined by your net worth. That's an example of a security if you're money centered.
Mm-hmm. For how it affects your security.
Right, how it affects your security. For guidance, it looks like profit is your decision-making criterion.
Yes.
Wisdom, money-making, is the lens through which life is seen and understood, creating imbalanced judgment. Power is that you are restricted to what you can accomplish with your money and your limited vision. Mm-hmm. So it goes through all those things, and you can read through those, and then really the ones that strike you the most are probably the ones that you tend to hold on to a little bit more than maybe the others.
Right. Again, without knowing, because he shines light on these issues and spells them out. I love how he has those graphs in there where he very clearly says, all right, so if this is your center, this is how your security in life is affected. This is how you're guided through life if you're centered on this. This is how your wisdom, how your applied knowledge, in other words, because that's what wisdom is, applied knowledge, this is how it's affected. And then also your power as well. So I love how he lays that out. It shines a light on things that honestly we wouldn't have recognized without it.
Yeah. And then he goes on to talk about what a principle center looks like with those four different avenues.
Yes.
Right. He talks about our security. If you're living from a principle center, our security comes from knowing that, unlike any other centers based on people or things, which are subject to frequent and immediate change, correct principles do not change, and we can depend on them. Principles don't react to anything.
Right.
They are changeless.
Yes.
And then he goes on, the wisdom and guidance that accompany principle-centered living come from correct maps, from the way things really are, have been, and will be. They enable us to see clearly when we want to go and how to get there. Personal power that comes from principle-centered living is the power of self-aware, knowledgeable, proactive, individual, unrestricted by the attitudes, behaviors, and actions of others, or by many of the circumstances and environmental influences that limit other people. Mm-hmm. So again, those are the things that kind of, again, just naturally flow out of you when you live a principle-centered life.
Yes.
And Here's an important thing that I underlined and want to highlight. As a principle-centered person, you try to stand apart from the emotion of the situation and and from other factors that would act on you and evaluate the options. And man, again, that's another thing that's easier said than done, right? But it's that same intentionality. I have these principles and this is what I want to live by. So I'm going to even stop, not have emotions, not be emotionless.
Right.
But say, okay, I have these emotions, but I'm not going to act on these emotions because these aren't guided by the principles that I live by.
Yes.
And man, what a key, again, paradigm shift of an idea to how to react to a situation.
Right. And he says that from the very beginning, from the Inside Out chapter, it's not about ignoring these emotions, pushing the pain away from yourself and not recognizing them. No, it is recognizing them. It's the choice you're making after the pain that is the difference. Mm-hmm. That is whether it's reactive or proactive. Because now that we know that we are responsible for the creating, it's time for us to start, which we highlighted in the first part.
And so right before this part, he gives an example of a work and life situation. He said they were planning on, a married couple were planning to go to a concert that evening, but he has an opportunity to stay and work late at his job and maybe get ahead or work on this project that needs to be done, that kind of thing. So he talks about how that decision-making process, deciding whether to stay at work or to go to the concert, would look depending on which center you're living from. Right. And he goes through all those, and all those are really interesting to kind of look through. He kind of helps bring those different centers to life and how they affect your real-world decision-making. Mm-hmm. So then he goes on talking about what I find is the most interesting part of here, if talking about being a principal, actually looking at that decision from a principle-centered perspective. He says, actually, whether you go to the concert or stay and work is really a small part of the effective decision. It's actually, it really is insignificant almost, the actual end result. He says you might make the same choice with a number of different centers. So even depending if you're work-centered or family-centered or marriage-centered, you'd still might come to the same conclusion that you would if you were principle-centered. Mm-hmm. But the several important differences when you are coming from a principle-centered paradigm, he lists these out. First, you're not being acted upon by other people or other circumstances, which is huge. You're making your own decision. Yeah. Second, your decision is most effective because it is based on principles with predictable long-term results. I think that's another, awesome thought too. These principles, they have long-term results. Like you've seen that when you act this way in line with your principles, these things tend to happen. You tend to have this kind of success or these kind of outcomes, right? You tend to expect like the outcome to be good because even if it's a hard decision, because it's based on those principles. Yeah. Third, what you choose to do contributes to your ultimate values in life, which again just helps you stay more true, I guess, to who you are and helps you just to be more of a real and authentic person, I think. Right. Fourth, you can communicate to your wife and your boss within the strong networks you've created in your interdependent relationships. Again, just brings that you have better communication with those people and can work with those people better when you live from your principles. And then finally, the last one, you'll feel comfortable about your decision. Whatever you choose to do, you can focus on it and enjoy it. And that's an important one too, man. Have you ever made a decision and then you felt like you made it because you had to, you didn't feel comfortable about it, and maybe you didn't even enjoy it. Right. I think that's happened to all of us at some point. Right. Yeah. Living by the principle instead of these other areas that you've covered here. Really, what it opens up is to more freedom, to more enjoying life. You don't really, you also begin to regret your decisions less. How many times have I walked away from a decision and regretted it because it goes against what I think is, an important value or principle in my life. But the difference is I haven't taken the time to write it down, to reflect on that, and then to make decisions based on that. Yeah. So, but then after this section, there are a couple sections that we covered pretty well, like writing and using the,
personal mission statement, using the whole brain, those things. But you have a section that we kind of missed over a little bit.
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to touch in between the mission statement writing and then the visualization and affirmation. Most of the mission statement writing, I think we got pretty well, and I won't cover it, although he goes into more detail on ways to create your mission and vision statement, which is important to read, I think, if that's something that you want to do. But there is a quote here that I want to point out, and he says there are a number of techniques in using your imagination. This is let me back up. This is how he's talking about coming up with those principles, right? How do you pull out those principles from yourself? Those are the ones that you want to live by. How do you visualize that? How do you pull those out of you? There are a number of techniques to using your imagination that can put you in touch with your values, but the net effect of every one I have ever used, this is him talking, Stephen Covey, is the same. When people seriously undertake to identify what really matters most to them in their lives, what they really want to be and to do, they become very reverent. They start to think in larger terms than today and tomorrow.
Right.
And, again, man, like, I think that's just such an interesting kind of like side effect of doing these exercises.
Right.
Is that you actually come to the conclusion of like, man, like you just have a better understanding of like what I think life is really about.
Right.
And you can then, that's why he said those people become more reverent. They just appreciate life, I think, on a higher level than we tend to do on a daily basis. It's bigger than just today and tomorrow. I think just going through all of these exercises in kind of pulling out your values, your principles that you want to live by, it just, again, it helps bring just a greater sense of the importance of life and to be able to live it well, and really it makes you appreciate life and kind of, again, puts into perspective the things that we kind of tend to worry about on a day-to-day basis are really probably not that important in the long run.
Yeah.
So it just gives you good perspective, I think, these exercises, doing these.
Yes, they do.
So let's continue to move on, and I'm going to, again, flip through a couple more pages here. And one thing I wanted to touch on is identifying roles and goals, which another thing we didn't quite touch on a whole lot in the first part, but I think this is important. He says, one of the major problems that arises when people work to become more effective is that they don't think broadly enough. And I think that's huge too. And he goes on to talk about kind of what this looks like. And when creating a personal mission statement, I think we can tend to be too focused in one area, like say maybe work or personal lives or etc. And we can tend to be that way in life, right? We go through seasons where, man, we're just work focused for a while, and other things like our health or our friends or whatever, they kind of drift to the side. Or we could be friend centered and we're not, putting as much thought and energy into work, and any kind of combination. The interesting thing, and I think is really helpful to me probably when I go out to write my own mission statement, is when he talks about just dividing it up into different roles. So we each play different roles depending on what social circles we're in, where we're at, what we're doing. Some of these people, he gives some examples, have sectioned their mission statement out into the roles that they play. So husband, father, son, Christian, neighbor, change agent, and even scholar. So separating those out into the different roles that you can play, kind of, I think that helps me personally, at least, just kind of be very, like he says, that I get all the topics, and I'm not too focused on just one area of my life, because again, it's all about balance.
Right. Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, man, you got it,
bro.
You feel
good about that?
No,
Okay.
I feel good about that.
All right, then we'll move on. You wanna? Is there anything you want to touch on as far as family mission statements or organizational mission statements here in the last couple sections of this?
No, because you mentioned that at the very beginning. I was interested to see what you wanted to say towards the end when it comes to kind of practicing this out, challenging yourself out. But you mentioned that in the first section pretty well. You didn't forget that. I did forget that. You did not forget that in the first section. So.
Yeah. So of course, the first chapter ended this way as well. I'm sorry, the first I think maybe all the chapters have ended this way actually, but the habit 1 chapter ended this way with application suggestions, and this chapter ends with application suggestions again. And basically he's talking about now we're taking those from the exercise of imagining our funeral and all the different sections of this chapter where he talks about writing your mission statement, basically bringing all that together and actually forming a mission statement for you personally. And maybe, of course, like I said, we might not come to a full conclusion of our mission statement in just a week. It may take a couple weeks, may take a couple months. But I say this week, as we're continuing to read, but also let's work through this. I think maybe a challenge for both of us. Let's just work through this, and then maybe at the beginning of next week we can kind of touch on this a little bit, come back to these application suggestions, and just talk about what we did, how we did it, and kind of what our kind of results are from implementing these suggestions.
Right.
So again, because like we said, it's not good just to know if we're not applying it into our life. So,
right.
And this is where the application comes in, is at the end of the chapter.
Yes. Yeah. I like how he ends with the application. They do build upon themselves. I like how this is a little bit shorter than maybe a 30-day challenge.
Yeah.
But this is a good way to end the chapter as we not only try to remember, but also apply what we read.
Yep. And it'll also help keep us accountable if we talk about it here.
Yes, true.
So if we come back next week and we're planning on talking about the application part of the chapter here at the very end, then we're definitely more likely to stick with it and do it out so that we can come back and have something to say, something to bring back for next week. So I think that's a good idea, and I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, me too, man.
Yeah. Anything you else want to say to wrap up this chapter?
I do not.
All right.
Good.
You're good. All right. So then that was habit 2, begin with the end in mind. And next week, we're going to take a look at habit number 3, which is put first things first.
Sweet.
And the chapter is called Principles of Personal Management.
Yep.
So should be good.
Yep. Thanks, man.
All right. I'll see you next time.
All right. See you next time.